The heat of the Bohemian night, tense and pulsating with the distant sound of atabaque drums, often transports me to other times, other heats. Youth is a flame that dances the same way in any century, and seeing a young couple exchanging whispered promises under the shade of a mango tree here in Salvador, I am thrown back across the ocean of time, to a cold garden, under a French moon, and to the eyes of a princess who ignited in me a fire I thought long extinguished. She said she loved me, ... but she did not know what I was. She did not know that the love she offered a ghost could only end in a tomb. Hers, not mine. It was the year 1419. France was a wounded nation, bleeding under the weight of the 100 Years' War and the madness of its own king, Charles VI. The Valois court, housed in the Grand Chateau de Troyes, was a viper's nest, dressed in silk and velvet. The opulence was a fever, a desperate attempt to mask the smell of decay and defeat that hung in the air. I was there under the guise of a scholar from distant lands, a nameless adviser, invited to decipher ancient texts. It was a role I often played throughout the centuries. It granted me access, but kept me conveniently on the sidelines, a silent observer in the theatre of mortal ambition. I saw her for the first time during a ball to welcome the English emissaries. The hall was a cacophony to my senses. The shrill sound of lutes, the rustle of brocades, the smell of sweat and wine mixed with heavy perfumes. I could hear the diplomatic lies exchanged in forced smiles, and feel the nervous pulse of blood under the skin of the courtiers as they negotiated the fate of nations. And in the midst of all this falsehood, she moved. Princess Catherine was a figure of stillness in a sea of exaggerated gestures. She wore a dress of a blue as deep as the night sky, and while everyone around her indulged in the dance of intrigue, her eyes seemed distant, carrying a sadness that was much older than her 18 years. It was the sadness of a daughter who watched her father's mind, the king's, shatter, and who knew that her own body was the primary bargaining chip in a humiliating peace treaty. I was not drawn to her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful. I was drawn to the silent strength in her posture, the dignity with which she wore her melancholy like a cloak. In a hall full of loud, empty souls, hers was a complex and contained melody. Later that night, she escaped to the gardens, seeking refuge from the suffocating air of the hall. I followed her, a shadow gliding between the yew hedges. The full moon bathed the stone statues in a milky light, and the air was fragrant with the smell of roses and damp earth. She was sitting on a marble bench near a fountain, her head tilted back, her eyes closed, as if trying to absorb the silence. A night too beautiful to be wasted on politics. Don't you think, Princess? My voice sounded softer than I intended. She startled, jumping to her feet, a hand on her chest. Her guards were at a respectful distance, at the garden's entrance. "Sir," she said, her voice firm despite the surprise, "you frightened me. I do not recognize you. I am Lysander, just a scholar fascinated by the stars," I replied, pointing to the sky. "And they seem brighter here, away from the torches and the ambitions of men." She relaxed a little, intrigued. We spoke. I did not speak of war or treaties. I spoke of the constellations that shone over Babylon, of the ancient Greek poets who described the same moon that now watched us. I spoke of a vast and eternal world, a world beyond the walls of her castle and her destiny. I watched her closely. I saw the blush rise up her neck, felt the rhythm of her heart accelerate, not with fear, but with an excitement she barely allowed herself to feel. I was a mystery, a breath of air from a world she only knew in books. To me, she was danger. The scent of her life, the purity of her blood, was a siren's song to my thirst. Every second by her side was a test of my centuries-old control. The beast within me wanted to taste the pulse that fluttered so delicately in her neck, but the man, or what was left of him, was fascinated by the light in her eyes. "Your words are different, Master Lysander," she said, as a cloud passed over the moon, plunging us into an intimate darkness. "They ask for nothing." "Perhaps I will ask for something now," I said, my voice a whisper. "Ask for what?" "Gold. A favor at court." "Kai, ask for permission to write to you, to continue our conversation on paper, where words can be more honest than in a king's gardens." Her eyes shone. "Seek a secret, a small act of rebellion in her rigidly controlled life." After a moment that seemed to last a lifetime, she nodded subtly. "There will be a way," she said, before turning and walking back towards the suffocating light of the castle. I remained in the shadows, watching her go. The beast within me was hungry, but another hunger, one I had not felt for so long I had almost forgotten its name, had awakened. It was the hunger for connection, to see the world through mortal eyes again. I knew that path could only lead to pain and loss. Split. But as she disappeared, I was already composing the first letter in my mind, sealing my own fate on that moonlit night. An immortal's curse is not the thirst for blood, but the inescapable memory of every soul he has touched and inevitably seen fade. And I knew, with a terrible and exciting certainty, that the soul of Catherine of Valois would be the one to haunt me the most. My first letter to Catherine was not written with the common court ink, tinged with flattery and ambition. I wrote it by moonlight, using a walnut pigment I prepared myself, my words flowing not like those of a suitor, but like those of an astronomer showing the universe to someone who had only ever known the confines of a room. Guy told her of the tides, of how the moon, that silent accomplice to our meeting, governed the world's oceans with an invisible pool. I told her of the lost cities in the desert, whose names time had already forgotten, but whose stories I held as my own. I did not offer her courtships. I offered her vastness. The challenge was finding a way to deliver such poison. The court was a labyrinth of eyes and ears. The solution came in the form of the royal library, a dusty and neglected place, for men of war rarely have time for words. In a forgotten tome on Euclidean geometry, I hollowed out a small compartment between the pages. Screed. I left my letter there, along with a single flower of night-blooming jasmine, whose fragrance I knew would guide her. The wait for her response was an agony I had not felt in centuries. Immortality dulls urgency. But for 3 days I found myself haunted by a mortal emotion, anticipation. I watched her from afar, seeing her play her role as princess with impeccable grace, and I wondered if my intrusion had been just a passing fancy for her. Then, on the 3rd night, I saw her slip into the library. When I returned to my hiding-place, the flower was gone, and in its place was a sheet of parchment, sealed with the wax of her house, but without the royal crest. Her handwriting was like her, elegant, precise, with a restrained strength. She did not respond to my stories with passive admiration, but with sharp questions. If the moon governs the tides, Master Lysander, what invisible force governs the hearts of kings? If cities turn to dust, what is the purpose of building empires? She challenged me, debated with me, revealing a mind as captivating as her spirit. Our correspondence became a duel of souls, waged in secret within the pages of a mathematics book. The letters fueled the fire, but soon they were not enough. We needed proximity, the shared danger of a meeting, under the pretext of consulting an ancient map. I arranged for her to meet me in a forgotten tapestry chamber, a place where the walls were covered with scenes of mythological hunts and battles, their colors faded by time. Dust danced in the beams of light that entered through a single high window. and the silence was so thick we could hear each other breathe. "Your letter about Babylon made me dream," she said, her voice a whisper so as not to disturb the woolen knights who watched us from the walls. "Dream that I am more than just a clause in a treaty." She spoke of her father, the king, not with anger, but with a deep sorrow. She described his fits of madness, how he sometimes did not recognize her, believing himself to be made of glass, afraid of shattering. "Sometimes I feel this entire court is made of glass," she confessed, "and we are all just waiting for the sound that will shatter us." As she spoke, I fought my own battle. Her proximity was a sublime torture. I could see the delicate flutter of a vein in her temple, hear the soft music of her flowing blood, a primordial invitation to the beast within me. The scent of her skin, a mix of roses and the unique fragrance of her own life, was an incense that threatened to intoxicate me. Sore, I focused on her words, using them as an anchor to tether me to my remaining humanity. Protecting her mind kept me from consuming her body. "I wish we could stay here forever," she sighed, looking at the tapestry that depicted a forbidden love between a goddess and a mortal. The word "forever," spoken by her mortal lips, was like a knife in my immortal chest. For her, it was an expression of desire. For me, it was the literal description of my curse. I knew that I could stay there forever, but she was a flower destined to wither. I moved closer, the desire to touch her almost unbearable. "Some moments, Catherine," I said, my voice hoarse. "Some moments contain an eternity within them." I took her hand. The warmth of her skin against mine, which is always cold, was like a shock. She held her breath, her eyes searching mine in the semi-darkness. I leaned in, the beast and the man at war within me. Her lips parted slightly. The entire world was reduced to that moment, to that space of a single breath between us. But I pulled back. With a force of will that cost me more than any physical battle I have ever fought, I released her hand and took a step back. I saw the confusion and hurt in her eyes. "It's dangerous," I murmured, the only truth I could offer her. "Not just for you, for me." Before she could answer, I turned and vanished into the shadows of the chamber, leaving her alone with the echo of a kiss that never happened. As I moved away, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. By pulling back, I had not protected her. I had only made her want more. I was dragging her into my eternal night, and with every letter, every meeting, I was tying her mortal fate to my immortal burden with threads of silk and poetry. And I knew that, in the end, those threads would become a shroud. Stixmat. My retreat in the tapestry chamber did not create distance. On the contrary, it ignited a flame. Catherine's letters, once filled with philosophical questions, became more intimate, more daring. She no longer asked about the stars, but about the scars she imagined I carried. She spoke not of lost kingdoms, but of the realm of her own confined heart. She sent me poems that she herself wrote, verses that spoke of a caged bird who dreamed of a night sky it had never seen. Every word from her was one more link in the chain that bound me to her mortal world. My replies became an exercise in poetic evasion. I could not tell her about the battles that gave me my scars, nor about the darkness that was my one true homeland. So I spoke in metaphors, describing the loneliness of a mountain or the thirst of a desert, in the hope that she would see her own pain reflected in mine, without ever suspecting the monstrous nature of its source. Our dangerous game of souls continued, hidden in the pages of a book on geometry, a universe of passion blooming in the silence of a dusty library. But silence in a royal court is never complete. It has ears. I began to feel a shift in the atmosphere around Catherine, a new kind of quietness, heavier, more vigilant. My senses, sharpened by centuries of self-preservation, detected the presence of new observers. Eyes that were not those of ordinary guards, but of men whose steps were trained to make no sound, whose craft was the collection of secrets. I felt them in the shadows of the corridors, in the dark corners of the galleries. Someone was watching us. My suspicion fell on the Count of Rochefort, a staunch ally of the Burgundian faction. He was a man whose ambition was as cold and hard as the steel of his sword. To him, Catherine was not a princess, but the centerpiece of a treaty that could consolidate the power of his allies. A secret romance, especially with an enigmatic foreigner like me, would be a direct threat to his meticulous plans. He was the guardian of her cage, and he had noticed that the bird was singing a new song. The perception of danger only made our meetings more urgent. On a stormy night, when the sound of thunder muffled that of footsteps, we met in the crypt beneath the castle chapel, a place of death, but the only one where we felt safe to live, dymatic. The light of a single candle danced on the stone tombs of her ancestors. "They want to marry me to the English king, Lysander," she said, her voice a whisper that could barely be heard above the storm. "They speak of it as if they were trading cattle. My value is that of a kingdom." "You are worth more than any kingdom, Catherine," I said, moving closer to her. The air in the crypt was icy, but I could feel the warmth emanating from her, a beacon of life in a place of eternal rest. This time it was she who acted. She reached out and touched my face. Her fingers were warm against my marble-cold skin. "You are always so cold," she murmured, not with revulsion, but with a tender curiosity. Her touch was like lightning. The beast within me roared, awakened by that simple contact, by the proximity of her pulse, a constant drum of life beneath her thin skin. It was in that moment of dangerous intimacy that I heard it. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible under the storm. The creak of an iron hinge at the top of the crypt stairs. Rochefort's men. They had followed us. They had cornered us. Panic flashed in Catherine's eyes when she saw the change in my face. "What is it?" she whispered. "Silence," I ordered. "Put out the candle." In total darkness, I became what I truly am, a creature of the night. Holding her tightly against me, I moved. To her, it must have seemed like a fever dream, a blur of impossible movement. We did not run. We flowed through the shadows, through forgotten passages that only I, with my night vision, could find. She felt only the wind, the sensation of flying low across the stone floor, the sound of her own heart beating out of sync. I led her back to her chambers through a path no guard knew, leaving her safely behind a tapestry that hid a secret door. She was breathless, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. "How?" she began to ask. "I know the secrets of this castle," I cut in, the only explanation I could give. "Kay, but now they know there is a secret to be known. Be careful, Catherine." After ensuring she was safe, fury took hold of me. The fury of a predator whose territory has been invaded. The poet and the scholar gave way to the hunter. Later that night, I found one of Rochefort's spies alone, in a narrow passage near the kitchens. He did not hear me approach. I pressed him against the cold stone wall, my hand on his throat, strong enough to keep him from screaming, but not to kill him. Not yet. His eyes widened in terror in the darkness, seeing only the faint gleam of mine. "Who are you?" he choked out. "I am the reason you will forget what you saw tonight," I hissed, my voice a sound that did not belong to a human. I let him feel a fraction of my power, the cold compulsion of my will seeping into his mind. "You will tell the Count that he was mistaken, that the princess was only praying for her sick father, and you will tell him that the shadows of this castle hold secrets far older and more dangerous than a maiden's romance." I released him, and he fell to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. If I see you near her again," I added, leaning in so he could see my eyes more clearly, I will not just erase your memory. I will erase your life. I turned and disappeared, leaving him with his terror. I had protected our secret, but the price was revealing to myself the dark nature of my affection. Love, for a being like me, is not expressed with flowers and sonnets, but with threats in the shadows and the promise of violence. I was becoming the monster she didn't know existed, all in the name of protecting her from it. My threat to the Count of Rochefort's spy did not bring the peace I had hoped for. On the contrary, it was like throwing a stone into a nest of sleeping wasps. The man, his mind clouded by my compulsion, and his body still trembling with a terror he could not explain, stammered his fabricated story to his master. Rochefort, a man whose life was dedicated to deciphering lies, did not believe the story, but he believed the fear. He saw the truth, not in the spy's words, but in his haunted eyes. He concluded, not that I was a monster from fairy tales, but something that, to him, was equally dangerous, a foreign agent of unknown power and influence, a sorcerer, perhaps, sent to sabotage the peace treaty and bewitch the princess. Catherine's cage, once golden, turned to iron. Rochefort, using his influence over the sick king, tightened the circle. Her trusted ladies-in-waiting were replaced by hawk-eyed women with attentive ears, ladies of the Burgundian faction. Her walks in the gardens were suspended. Access to the library was restricted. Every step she took was watched. Every word she spoke was analyzed. Our channel of communication, the old geometry book, was silenced. Her prison was now almost absolute, and I, with all my power, was forced to watch from the shadows, helpless that the anger I felt was a cold ember in my chest. I could have entered Rochefort's chambers in the middle of the night and turned his ambitious heart to ash. But I knew that the sudden, unexplained death of one of the most powerful men in France would plunge the court into chaos. And Catherine, the centerpiece of all the intrigue, would be the first to suffer the consequences. For the first time, my immense strength was a weakness. I was chained by the need to protect her, forced to play the slow, subtle game of mortals. The forced separation only intensified our longing. I would see her from afar, at state dinners or public appearances, a pale and regal figure, her eyes searching for mine in the crowd. In these stolen glances, we exchanged volumes of despair and longing, and I saw the noose tightening around her. The English delegation became more present, and the name of Henry V was now whispered in every corner as an inevitability. The invisible groom was coming to claim his promised bride. Desperate, we planned one last meeting. It was she who orchestrated it, using the only freedom she had left, that of visiting the chapel to pray for her father's soul. Through an elderly and compassionate priest, she sent me a message, a single word: twilight. That night I met her in the confessional, the most sacred place, and, therefore, the most ignored by spies. We were separated by the wooden lattice, our voices mere whispers in the darkness scented with incense and beeswax. "They will sign the treaty any day now, Lysander," she said, her voice thick with urgency. "I will be sent to England, to the bed of a man I have never seen, an enemy of my people. This life is not mine." She paused, and her next words struck me with the force of a stake to the heart. "Take me with you." I closed my eyes. The simplicity of her request, the purity of her faith in me, was the cruelest of tortures. She saw in me a scholar, an adventurer, a man from a different world. She could not see the monster. "Run away with me," she pleaded. "To the distant lands you write about. I don't care about crowns or castles. I just want a life. Quit with you." Every word of hers was a nail in my coffin of self-control. How could I explain? How could I tell her that the life I could offer her was an eternity of twilight, of thirst, and of loneliness, that she would never grow old, but would also never again feel the warmth of the sun on her face, that she would never have the children she dreamed of, and would watch everyone she loved turn to dust, that to run away with me would not be a liberation, but the exchange of one cage for another, much darker and more eternal. "I cannot, Catherine," I replied, and the sound of my own voice was that of shattering glass. "My life is not mine to give. I am bound by oaths older than the kingdoms of your father and the King of England combined. I am not the free man you imagine." The silence that followed was terrible. I could feel her hope unraveling, her heart breaking against the coldness of my words. It sounded like a rejection, a coward's excuse. The truth was that it was the only true act of love I could offer her, to let her remain human, to let her live and die as nature intended. The sound of hurried footsteps in the chapel's nave broke the spell. A royal messenger, his breath ragged, was calling for the princess. "Your Highness." News from the council chamber. The king. Come in a moment of clarity. "He has signed. The Treaty of Troyes is done. You are to be the Queen of England." Through the lattice I saw the last light in Catherine's eyes go out. The news, which was supposed to seal the peace between two nations, was the death sentence for our small world. She stood up, no longer a young woman in love, but the regal, resigned figure her role demanded. She did not look back. "Goodbye, Master Lysander," she said, her voice empty of all emotion. And then she was gone. I remained alone in the darkness of the confessional, the smell of incense suddenly suffocating me. Kai had saved her from Rochefort's wrath, kept her politically pure for her sacrifice, and in doing so I had lost her forever. The monster that lurks in the shadows had won, not by drinking her blood, but by breaking her heart. Here and in my long and cursed life I had never felt so monstrous. The weeks that followed our farewell in the confessional were the longest of my existence. Time, which for me is normally a slow and steady river, became a swamp of agony. I remained at the Valois court, a spectre haunting the corridors, unable to leave, yet forced to witness the preparations for her sacrifice. The castle, once a place of tense intrigue, now buzzed with a forced joy. Tapestries were changed, minstrels rehearsed celebratory hymns, and English nobles, once enemies, now walked the courtyards with a victorious arrogance. For them, it was the dawn of peace. For me, it was the twilight of a feeling I should never have allowed to flourish. I had no further contact with Catherine. Occasionally, I would see her from a distance, an ethereal figure at state dinners or formal audiences. The change in her was subtle, but to my senses it was a scream. The flame of rebellion in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by an icy composure. She moved and spoke with the precision of a regal automaton, playing her role as future queen with a desolate perfection. No one else saw the young woman who dreamed of Babylon and wrote secret poetry. They saw only the queen, but I saw the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. I heard the melody of her heart, which once quickened with emotion, now beat to a slow, resigned rhythm. I had broken her, and the world applauded the beauty of her fragments. The wedding day, June 2nd, 1420, arrived under a pale and indifferent blue sky. The cathedral of Troyes was filled with the nobility of France and England, two enemy kingdoms united in a fragile alliance sealed with the soul of a woman. I positioned myself in a dark gallery in the depths of the cathedral, a shadow among the stone columns, the only guest in mourning at that celebration. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and melted wax, but to me it smelled of a funeral. When the great doors opened and she began to walk down the aisle, a reverent silence fell over the congregation. She was a vision, a sacrificial pawn dressed in white and gold. Her face was a mask of impassive serenity. Her eyes which once sought mine with longing and curiosity, were now fixed on the altar, on her destiny. Sea passed by me, just a few feet away, but her world and mine were now separated by an impassable abyss. At the altar, Henry V of England awaited her. I studied him. He was not the monster I wished him to be. He was a warrior king, tall and confident, with eyes that held the certainty of a man who never doubted his right to conquer what he desired. He looked at Catherine not with love, but with a sense of possession and triumph. She was not a woman to him. She was France, personified and delivered into his hands. She was the final piece in his game for power. I heard them exchange their vows. The Latin words echoed in the stone nave, each one a blow to my conscience. Till death do them part. The irony was crushing. Death, for them, was the end of a life. For me, it was just the beginning of an eternity haunted by the memory of that moment. I, who am the very negation of death, was witnessing the death of her heart, when the ceremony ended and they turned to the crowd. Now, as husband and wife, king and queen, the shouts of "Long live the king, long live the queen" filled the cathedral. As they walked back down the aisle, amidst a shower of flower petals, Catherine's eyes swept the crowd, perhaps out of habit, perhaps in a final, desperate reflex. For a fraction of a second her gaze met mine, hidden in the darkness of the gallery. In that instant, time stood still. I saw everything in her eyes. There was no love, no anger. There was only a hollow recognition, the ghostly memory of a dream that had died. I saw the pain of her betrayal and the bitter acceptance of her reality. Thin, the moment shattered. She blinked, and the queen's mask was back in place. She turned to her husband, forced a smile for the crowd, and continued her march out of the cathedral, towards her new life, towards her golden cage in England. I remained in the shadow, long after the cathedral had emptied, listening to the echo of the celebratory cheers. I had made the right choice. I had kept her human. I had saved her from my curse. But as I watched the royal procession move away from the city, a cavalcade of hope for two kingdoms, I felt the crushing weight of my victory. I had saved her, yes, but at what cost? I had delivered her to a life of loveless duty and condemned myself to an eternity with the memory of what might have been. Yet, at that moment, I understood the true nature of my curse. It is not the thirst for blood, nor the loneliness. It is the capacity to love like a mortal, but be forced to suffer loss like a god. And there was nothing, in all my vast and terrible existence, that hurt more. I left France behind, like a man fleeing the scene of a crime. The crime, in this case, was against my own heart. For years, I became an aimless wanderer, seeking oblivion in the deserts of Persia and the bustling ports of Constantinople. I tried to drown myself in the flow of time, in the rise and fall of petty potentates, in the intrigues of merchants and the dogmas of new religions. But the memory of Catherine was a stubborn companion. I saw her in the face of every young woman who dared to look at me with curiosity, heard the echo of her voice in the sound of a lute played from a distance. The world of men, however, continued to turn. The news, even for a recluse like me, travels like the wind. I learned that she had given birth to a son, an heir to the throne of England, Henry VI. The news was a precise stab, the final, irrefutable proof of the life I could never give her, the normality of motherhood, the continuity of flesh and blood. The warrior king, her husband, had his heir. His victory was complete. But the wheel of mortal destiny turns quickly. Just 2 years after the wedding, I learned of Henry V's death. The great conqueror, the Lion of England, struck down not in battle, but by a fever on French soil. For men, it was a cataclysmic event that changed the course of the war. For me, it was a reminder of the futility of it all. Tig-Tig, my involuntary rival, was now just dust. While I continued to walk under the same moon that had shone on our meeting in the garden, his death brought me no joy, only a deep emptiness. He was not the villain of our story. He was just another mortal pawn, as was she. The true villain was my own nature. With the king's death, I imagined her in her new loneliness, a dowager queen in a foreign land, mother of a child king, surrounded by ambitious and distrustful English lords. Her cage had become larger, but perhaps more lonely than ever. My protective instinct, the beast I had chained, stirred. The urge to go to her, to offer comfort, was immense. But I held back. My presence in her life would only bring more danger and scandal. Greatest act of love I could still offer her was my continued absence. Then, years later, a rumor reached my ears, a whisper that traveled from London to the taverns of Genoa, where I was residing at the time. A rumor so scandalous that most dismissed it as fantasy. The dowager queen, Catherine of Valois, had fallen in love again, not with a prince or a duke, but with one of her servants, a Welsh squire of modest birth named Owen Tudor. They had married in secret and had children far from the eyes of the court. Upon hearing that, the initial pang of an old possessive jealousy was quickly replaced by an emotion that surprised me, a deep and overwhelming relief. My sacrifice had not been in vain. The heart I had broken, which I thought I had turned to ice, proved to be more resilient than I was. She did not resign herself to her golden cage. She found a way to love again, to build a secret and true life for herself, defying the conventions and the men who tried to control her. The flame I had seen in that garden had not gone out. She had protected it and used it to keep herself warm. She chose life, mortal passion, the glorious mess of humanity. And in doing so, she set me free. The news of her death, in 1437, came to me like a cool breeze on a summer night. She was only 35 years old. A short life, even by the standards of her time. I felt, not the sharp pain of loss, but the gentle melancholy of a chapter closing forever. Years later, I traveled to England and, under the cloak of night, visited her tomb in Westminster Abbey. I stood there, in the silent darkness, a ghost paying homage to another. Her life had been brief, but her legacy was immense. Those secret children she had with her Welsh lover would give rise to a new dynasty, the Tudors, who would change the face of England forever. She, the French princess traded for peace, ended up planting the seed of a new empire back in the present. Here in Salvador, the couple under the mango tree gets up to leave, their laughter fading into the warm night. I watch them go, and the mirror of memory shows me Catherine, not as the heartbroken queen in the cathedral, but as the vibrant young woman in the garden, talking about stars. Her love was not a wound that crippled me. It was a lesson, taught me that the true curse of immortality is not the thirst or the loneliness, but the risk of forgetting what it means to be human. Catherine made me remember. Her love, as impossible and tragic as it was, reconnected me to the world I had decided only to observe. And for that, in my cold and immortal heart, the memory of the Queen of Valois is not a curse. Sinemet, it is a blessing, and, like all truly precious things, I will keep it forever.